Join our knowledgeable hosts as they dive into the captivating universe of comic books, movies, TV shows, and pop culture. Get ready for vibrant discussions and a shared enthusiasm for all things superhero and beyond. A comic podcast straight from the panels. This is Beyond the Capes.
All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Beyond the Cape podcast. With us today is Nathaniel of Excavation Comics. We met him at Fan Expo Chicago. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here, talk about some comics that we've got coming up.
Definitely, we got a lot to talk about. You have some very great comics that are already out. We always like to ask every creator, we always like to ask you guys, of all the things you could choose in this world, maybe some that pay more money, maybe different hobbies, why did we all choose this whole enclosure of all the things? What made you go to comics?
So, interestingly enough, I started in film. And so sometimes people start in film and comics and go to film, but I actually started by going to my undergraduate degree was in acting. And I took some film writing courses and things like that. And so my focus was mostly in film. And while I was in school, I had the idea for Beatbox in my undergraduate education. And while I was there, I wrote an entire feature screenplay of this story called Beatbox in Tune. And I was trying to find a way to shop it around. And then right after I graduated, shortly thereafter was the global pandemic. So the entire industry shut down. Nobody was reading anything new. Nobody was trying anything new. Production had stopped. So there was this kind of lack of creativity. And I was working as a police officer for the LAPD as well during that time. And so I had a lot of stuff that I was seeing that was like dark. It was, very heavy, some light stuff too. But during the pandemic, there were a lot of crimes of despair and things like that going on. And so I felt like it was time to pull that idea out of the closet and adapt it to a different medium, get it out there. I had so much of this stuff going through my head, and so I decided, well, it's a superhero story, right? What better medium is there for that than a comic book? That is the original inception of the superhero idea, was through comics. That nobody really did it better than comics. And so why not try and take a visual medium, it's adjacent to film,
Yeah, for sure.
Comics and storyboarding are very similar. How you write a screenplay and how you write a comic, there's some fundamental differences, but the basics are still the same. Dialogue is still the same, engaging dialogue. And then, but visually it's slightly different. You have the action dialogue, and you have to write out each panel as if you were doing it like a storyboard instead of like a TV or film scene, so I started doing like my sort of cursory investigation. So what is this going to cost? Can I actually do this on my own? And the more I started digging, I found like a bunch of old posts by Jim Zub, who posted like a bunch of tutorials on his website on how to make comics. And I started reading through these articles, and they were really concise, and they got to the kind of meat of what you need to do and how you need to do it. And so I started playing around, and I did like a 10-page comic called The Final Five, which was this medieval executioner story. And I hired an artist, and we put it out there, and I was excited and happy because it was my first comic. It was the very first one, but it wasn't entirely what I imagined, and I still knew that I could do better. So I took what I learned from that experience, and I started hunting for people for Beatbox in Tune. I rewrote the script, and I broke it down into a number of episodes or issues, and I started like looking for my team. And that process took forever. It took a long time to find somebody who had a very nice style that would capture and do what I needed it to do to tell this story in a way that would be effective and connect with readers. And so I ultimately, I was reaching out to artists, who were more established. And then I would be poking around like, Instagram hashtags, and I'd be going through the Reddit archives of people posting their portfolios. And it was like this hole that I just kept taking down. And I kept finding all of these people, some of which, we did test pages with. Some people, I would just be reading their comics and I'd be like, wow, this guy really knows what he's doing. Little did I know that guy's already, working at Marvel and DC and that kind of thing, or Image or Dark Horse. And so it was hard to find people who had that level of talent, and also had the free time to take on an entirely independent book. It is a huge time commitment for an artist to pick up and, drop everything to work on an unknown writer, an untested idea. And so as I was looking around, I'd be asking people, well, hey, if you can't do it, who do you recommend? And so people would start bouncing names around, and one name would lead to another and another and another. And I think at one point, somebody recommended Matt Gaudio, who is an Italian-American comic artist. And he went to the Joe Kubert School out of New Jersey. And I remember looking up his portfolio, and I was looking through his stuff, and I was like, his work is beautiful, but underneath the work, there was a tone of emotion that he was capturing in his illustrations that I thought was vital to what I was trying to do with Beatbox and Tune. And so I reached out to Matt, and we started having a conversation. I sent him the script. We had some talks about tone and thoughts, and ultimately Matt was like right between that place where he had done Betty Page, and he had done a John Wick comic and things like that. And he's kind of like, he was like this guy who was just such a good artist, but then wasn't getting the gigs that he should have been getting at the time. And so I was like, well, let's make this comic together. It's a chance for, both of us to kind of show what we can do. And ultimately it led to Beatbox and Tune issue 1, which I'm super happy with how that one turned out. And I think it's an interesting, start to hopefully a great story for readers.
Definitely. And you'd be surprised. I would say the amount of people we've had on the show that have now started off as film that have gone into comics, especially on the indie scene.
Really?
I would say it's more prevalent more than anything. And I think that is because people have realized that if you write a script, the prose of the story, you guys know beginning, middle, end, climax, like resolution. So it is the same. But I will say, and I am wondering if you fell into like, I wouldn't say the same trap, but one of the harder things, and that is writing a 300-page script, and then realizing in comic books you need to now take a third of that, and even out that third that you just condensed it down to, those 4 pages of that third, that's going to be a single issue. Was that a challenge?
A lot of the visual stuff, and when I'm working with Matt and I give him a script, I always assume like we're going to add 1 or 2 pages. That's me personally. I always assume that. And we call them free pages. They're not written into the script. We're like, if we have the budget for it and there's an opportunity, or he sees an opportunity to enhance a scene, then he's got 1 or like 2 sometimes free pages to play with, and he can insert those pages wherever he wants. And like, we'll discuss where they might go and like the layouts, and, have a conversation where like, hey, I think, we could make this 2 panels, or we could make, and if we extended this out and I just like took my time with the paneling, it might make this scene like a little richer. And so that's where the collaboration and the negotiation comes into our storytelling process. And I think it's actually a really great way to work, because it gives the artist a lot of freedom, and it gives me an opportunity to learn from some of his expertise. And so I would say like, but the 300-page script thing was not as big of an issue, because the way I learned how to write is that you were supposed to trim down. You cut the fat.
Yeah.
It was a program like designed to churn out good writers, and so we in most of the classes I was taking, if anything was fluff or too much, it would just get cut, or and nowadays I'm kind of playing with like adding a little bit more, because I like a little bit more, or like even just like adding a moment or a line that brings you back into reality, or like grounds it, is like very fun to find places to do that. And sometimes you won't even find them until the whole thing is done, and then afterwards, when you're going through the lettering process, you might be like, you know what, let's add this line there, because that character isn't saying anything that Matt had drawn in. And so his imagination and my imagination and everyone's like collaborative work is actually elevating something. Yeah. So it was less about like cutting things down and more about rearranging dialogue and thinking in terms of like, how many characters can we have in this panel? How much dialogue can we fit in this panel? In a screenplay, you could have two people sitting at a table and have a conversation last half an hour. If you really wanted to, you could do it in film. But in comics, I mean, geez, how many pages, how much money are you going to burn doing that? Once you have everything set up in film, you can kind of do a lot of different things, because the more you have to move locations, the more expensive things get. Once you have a set amount of time at a location, that's your time to play, and get what you have to get done. But people do like extra takes all the time just to see what else they can get out of something. So it was more about that. It was more about like, okay, what pieces of dialogue can I add to this, or do I have to take away or rework or move this dialogue to this panel? And so it was a reduction in a different kind of way. It was almost like a rearranging rather than a complete cutting of
more of a formatting than anything.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Now what is interesting is when we did meet at Fan Expo, I did not know about your time on the LAPD, which it makes sense now, which makes a lot of sense when I read issue
that
1.
First scene, right? Yeah.
I can see where the inspiration drawn, and you could read in the first issue that you definitely have a well understanding of, I wouldn't say like the dark, but you understand kind of like criminal processing, how the whole setup of this is how like the empire works, this is how we bust it, this is how we break it, which is great. Did you ever worry sometimes that you had almost too like, it's like when I watch medical shows, like my wife refuses to watch it with me because I'm just going to point out, no, we don't use that. No, that's not real. Did you worry in your comic that you had almost kind of too much information, that you didn't want it to, still want it to be fun and like a comic book with heroes, someone people can read, but not so heavy down that like, well, this is the true way that, this is how it is. This is the real world. To kind of elevate it out of that.
It's kind of funny you should say that, because like the way I wanted to approach it was like, I wanted this to feel like a real scene. And like the first scene, we start with the villain.
Yep.
And most hero stories, you actually start with, the hero or like the protagonist of the story. But in this case, I felt like everything that happened to him drives the story down the road. It is the moment, and you have that hero moment, right? Where they like become the hero they're supposed to be, like with Uncle Ben and Spider-Man, Bruce Wayne and his parents in the alley, but it's like in this, I was like, well, I was always fascinated with like, okay, the Joker's origin, and like him falling in the vat, or like, things like that. I was always fascinated, like, and we never really always got enough of that in the comic, where we were like, okay, yeah, he fell in and then he went crazy because of the chemical reaction. And you're right. Yeah, but why? What was awoken in him that was there before? And that's what I wanted to explore. So when I originally wrote the scene, I was like, well, let's go invincible with this thing. Let's go like super bloody, super violent. And Matt was like, no, like, let's pump the brakes on it a little bit, which I thought was a really wise choice in the end. To sort of, because the first scene handles domestic violence, which is a very real issue in our society, in the world, you know, and during the pandemic, it was out of control because people were trapped at home. And so issues people were having with their marriages were made worse by the fact that they didn't have space. They couldn't get away. They couldn't, you know, think, they couldn't, you know, reflect, and they couldn't come together and have civilized dialogue. People were frustrated. People felt trapped, you know, so it's a different time. And so it was important for me to display it in a way that was truthful to the way it can happen for people and the way I've seen it play out. But ultimately the conversation with Matt and about like, what are we trying to achieve with this scene was that you have a young boy whose life is destroyed. You know, you have three people's lives that are destroyed in domestic violence. You have the person who commits the domestic violence. Their life is destroyed because they could see jail time. You have and, you know, something like counseling could easily eliminate that from ever having to have happened, you know, and sometimes not, but sometimes yes, you know, and people, you know, they take their stressors out, you know, and it's like, that's a very well-known thing in police work where it's like, you have to take care of your mind as much as your body. And the second victim is, I mean, everyone else essentially, but like in this scene, it was the mother who literally ends up, you know, losing her life. And then you have a young boy who will never be the same again after this incident. And so everyone becomes a victim when violence breaks out in society. You know, we all are witnesses to it. It affects us all in different ways. And so, but the young boy, Max Malcolm, who's our antagonist, sort of our gray antagonist character, is the focus of this. And it's like, what specifically about him ultimately changes because of this incident? And how is that going to affect his relationships in the future? How is that going to affect his ability to maintain healthy friendships? And how does that change his view of men in society, of women in society? How does, you know, so all of these things that impact someone mentally when they go through a traumatic incident like that ultimately aren't sorted out the way they should be, plays a massive role in everything that happens. And so it's, you know, domestic violence rarely makes the news too, you know, unless it's by a famous person or towards a famous person. It almost never makes the news. And yet it happens every single day. So I wanted it to be truthful, but Matt wanted it to be toned down a little bit so it didn't alienate readers. And you also have to be careful because people have trauma. People have lived through that, you know, too. And, you know, even when I go to a crime scene, I'm not necessarily living through it. I'm experiencing it, though, the aftermath of what happens. I have to document, you know, the accounts from both parties. I have to, you know, and I have to be as impartial as possible because we're talking about people's freedom. And so it's like, it is very difficult. And it's like, and in California, there's like, who's the dominant? There's a term called dominant aggressor, meaning two people could be violent with each other, but who was the one who started it? Who was the one who inflicted the most physical harm? So there's like so many different parts of this, and it's a very difficult crime to investigate because people are not always truthful. And so I was trying to show this in a way that was a truthful expression of how it could happen to somebody, you know, based on my experience and background. And then everything after that is, how does it play out in the end? And you see that in different forms when you go to, you know, mental health institutions for young kids, you know, and things like that. And they're dealing with the anger and the sort of like buried, or sometimes not even buried. They're very like, you know, very vocal about what happened to them, you know, and so but it's like you see it play out, you know, on society in different people.
Yeah.
You know, so it's that's why I wanted to start with that. And ultimately I think Matt was wise to counsel me to tone it down, but I still think it's very impactful even as it is now.
Yeah, I mean, the scene was very, like, the whole beginning of the story, I mean, really paints a picture of kind of what we're getting into, and it very simply lays out why our character is going to be the way that he is, which is later definitely animated, just in his first few seconds of the fight that we see kind of in episode 1. You could kind of tell that those experiences definitely play a part into how he handles those situations, which brings us to the whole point why we're here, and that is to talk about, this is as we were talking before, so Beatbox and Tune, for everyone listening, they have a wild story to catch up on. What would be your elevator pitch to them, or your convention talk to tell them what is the story about?
So I often talk about, when someone comes to my booth, I'll often give them, my pitch is pretty simple, but it's a story about two fraternal twin brothers. One plays music, one fights, and depending upon the music, his powers change. And then you have a villain named Mute who can eliminate sound. And so you've got this hero essentially chasing somebody who can basically eliminate his ability to use his powers. And then on top of that, you know, if they're still standing there, then I'll give them more, you know, so then I'll get into the fact that it's like, you know, it's handling things, you know, family drama and other stuff. And that, you know, Max and Harry, you know, Mute and Beatbox, they have a friendship that slowly develops. And through the first 3 issues, that's kind of what I'm trying to reveal slowly, is like, you have this hero and he's hunting this guy and you don't even see him, you know, but then in issue 2, you get to meet him and you understand like why this friendship begins, why Max appeals to Harry as a person. And then you see what happens to Harry, and then you realize that they're not that different. And so one of them ends up going one path and one of them goes the other, but they're still trying to look out for each other, you know, and it becomes like a very complicated relationship, as relationships are. So, you know, I'll kind of go into a little bit more detail to kind of get people excited. But honestly, like, you know, my biggest thing is a great comic sells itself.
Yeah.
Generally, you know, people are tentative sometimes to pick up something from an unknown entity. But if there's great art on the table, you know, it at least pulls them in to say, like, "Ooh, what's this?" You know, that kind of looks cool, or, you know, the colors are very interesting. You know, this might be for me. And so I think usually the pitch helps a lot, because it kind of outlines what it is and how the powers work and that kind of thing. And I think that that's important, because it's one of the fundamental aspects, but the powers aren't the story that I want to tell. They're just an aspect of it.
Yeah.
That I think is like a unique twist. I don't think we've ever had a superhero that had powers quite like this. You know, we've had sound superheroes before, but usually it was always about the sound coming from them, not the sound giving them the powers. So I was like, well, I started as a ballet dancer, you know, back before college. And when I was walking, you know, I was thinking, well, what would be a cool superhero that's like not been done? And I was thinking, well, sound superheroes, there aren't that many of them. And there's kind of only so many ways in which you can sort of use sound as a tool in a superhero's belt, you know? And so I was like, well, music influences how you move and dance, right? So what if rock music gave him super strength, and like, you know, jazz music gave him something else? And I was like, oh, well, there you go. You know what I mean? So sound influencing ability, you know, influencing movement, influencing a fight for the better or for the worse. And so it is a sort of ability that's required on outside sources to be used, which I liked that. It felt like it grounded it a little bit in reality, and it also made it a power vulnerable. And then I was like, well, what if I had a superhero that could get rid of sound? And I was like, just to combat that. It's a very sort of unique idea. But then I thought about it further, and I'm like, well, what if he used it? What if this guy used his powers in other ways? What if he used it to silence people? What if he used it to, to take somebody's voice away is a powerful thing, especially in our society, the way it is today. You have people that are very outspoken, but what if, like, all of a sudden you didn't get a choice? What if you couldn't speak out? What if you couldn't say what you really felt, or what or things like that? I think that's fundamental to who we are as people, is being able to express our thoughts and ideas. And so it's like, what if you had someone who could strip that away from you? And not only on top of that, but also take away your ability, because you can't defend yourself verbally.
Correct.
If somebody takes away your ability to speak. And I felt like, almost like, how, Black Bolt can't speak. And if he speaks, he speaks with purpose, or out of extreme pain or things like that, because of the restriction he has. So I thought about it with a different lens. What if you could take away someone's ability to speak? Or what if you could manipulate space down a hallway, or blow up a bomb and no one hears it? They only feel the shake, or things like that. And it's an interesting, stealthy kind of ability that allows someone to be extremely effective at accomplishing their goals and controlling. And that's a big thing, because, like, Max, during this first scene, he has no control over his life. And so now he has this ability where he can control something, and that something is sound.
Definitely. No, I think it shows in the work. Now, one of the things that I'm more curious about as well, the film people we've had on the show, you guys are very good at writing for both kind of the hero and the villain, because you are seeing a project kind of on both sides, because you're looking to make a film. Whereas a comic book writer or artist growing up, I mean, everyone wants to draw, Wolverine. There's not a lot of people that want to, like, oh, I love Magneto, he's my hero. There are a few. But it's very hard for them in that first book to kind of write the villain, because they're so used to wanting the hero to win. I mean, that's, for them, it's the hero's journey, the hero's story. You have a little bit more, because you're trying to tell a complete story. Did you still struggle with writing one side versus the other, or did it flow pretty naturally?
I actually related a lot more with Max's voice than Harry's. Harry's kind of came from, like, as a kid, I grew up in very rural Montana, and I had, like, big dreams. I wanted to do, I wanted to go to this. I grew up in a town of, like, 6,000 people. The next town was like an hour and a half away by car. And the town further than that was 2.5 hours away in central Montana. So it's like, you really had to, like, if you wanted to go somewhere, you had to drive and commit a serious amount of time. And so when I was a kid, I loved growing up in a small town. There were great benefits to that. And I still cherish, that childhood. But at the same time, when I hit a certain age and my brother was going to college and he was leaving, I didn't want to be there anymore. I wanted to go out and I want to see the rest of the world. And I wanted to be part of a larger society, with a lot more creativity going on. And so I started looking for opportunities, and dance is ultimately something that led me to those opportunities. And, when a door opens, walk through it, let people decide you just work on your art and you work on your creativity, and you let other people decide if it's worth their time, but it's still worth your time. It's still worth my time, because the result is most important to you. You know what I mean? So I ventured out, and, like, when I got out, I got to see more of the world, and I got to experience more of how it is. And so that in me is a little bit of Harry. Harry wants to, he doesn't want like the grand dream, though. He doesn't want to be a superhero. He doesn't want to be a CEO, the president. a doctor. He just wants to be creative and he wants to dance. And that is the thing that gets taken from him. And it really, he doesn't have much. He just has these simple goals. And that's enough for a lot of people. People don't realize that, like, having a nice, having a giant home is not always what people want. People sometimes just want a stable income where they have enough food on the table and they can pay for their kids to go and, go to summer camp and things like that. And they're not asking for much. They're asking for enough. And so that's Harry. Harry's asking for enough, but when everything gets like that is his whole world. And so when that gets taken away from him, he loses sight of like the point of it all, because he didn't dream big. He dreamed fairly small, something, that he was good at, that he could attain some success in, and then he lost it. And so, at that point he was reeling, trying to self-evaluate and like readjust, so he in this comic he fails, right? And it's embarrassing for him, but he really fails for in the view of his father, and that's what's soul crushing. But later on the failure mounts, it grows. And so this is how, like, a lack of positive thinking can just kind of snowball. One thing kicks you down, and if you don't get up quickly enough, and then another thing kicks you down. And so it's like, and that's kind of like life when things get rough. And so that part of me, that also happened to me a lot. When I left Montana, I was in New York City. I was running around. I had no money. I was like, eating bread out of a sandwich bag, a big loaf of white bread. And that was my lunch and my dinner kind of a deal, because I just didn't have any cash and I was bouncing around, sleeping on floors and that kind of thing. But I loved it at the same time, because there was a sense of freedom there and excitement of being in New York City, being in a large place. But then, you start to realize, okay, well, then, some bad stuff happens, or like, you try to do something and you fail, or you don't succeed in the way you'd like. And so, like, when the bad stuff starts piling up, it begins to get harder to think positively about the future and about your world. A lot of bad stuff's happening in our society, in our world right now. And so you see a lot of people without hope. And so Max represents a little bit of that. It's like he's trying to find some hope, and he tries to give it to himself. He tries to give it to Harry, and that's sort of their dynamic. They're symbiotic in a way. And when they're both together, they do well, but when they separate, they don't. They rely on each other, maybe more than they should, but they do. Yeah. And so that's the thought behind some of the stuff that readers will see in issue 2, issue 3, between the two of them.
Definitely.
Yeah. Max was always easier to write for me because of, his sort of pessimism. But there's always that little bit of optimism too. And like when he loses the optimism, that's when he becomes a villain, like all of it. When it's really gone, that's when he becomes somebody who he shouldn't have been. His father, for example.
Yeah. Awesome. And you are correct. When we were talking, I was going to ask that before you got into about the power set. I would say this is kind of a first, at least for the beatbox, like the music controlling. We've had some power sets where silencing to a degree, or is more of like silencing power versus sound. Now, what is interesting is because your comic is kind of taking place in the modern world. Number one, having the power to cancel sound, or just any sound at all. If people are listening to this, silencing your own footsteps makes you one of the most dangerous people around.
Yeah, it does. And people don't realize how important your ears are until you can't hear. It's very hard, and especially in like police work, like when we'd be searching a building and like some guy would sneak up behind us and be like, "Hey guys," you'd be like, "Oh my gosh," it's like, where did you come from? It's terrifying when somebody sneaks up on you, and it's like it's like, he can get in wherever he wants, and if like they can't hear him, as long as they can't see him, but if they can't hear him, then he can literally go wherever he wants to go, so.
Yeah. I mean, having a gun and just like muffling it, but still firing the bullet. I mean, that's.
Yeah. I mean, and that's what I mean. It's like that sort of like, and I was using a bomb as an example, but like even just like, the way I want to use his character is that he becomes this sort of terrifying person, because like when you lose the ability to hear, it almost feels like you're being hunted by him. And that can be really terrifying, especially in an area where you also can't see well or something like that, So there's a lot of potential with that. And it's such a simple power, and sometimes those simple powers, like Beatbox's power, is like much more difficult to explain to people, and then people like to speculate, like, or like, what if this music gave him this kind of thing, or, that kind of thing. And that's sort of fun. That's really, did you see that Netflix show with like that character, the Praetorian?
Yeah.
So that I thought that was really clever when they released, that, and that was a comic before, but I never had a chance to read the comic, but I watched the show and I was like, oh, you've got people gambling on like which powers he's going to have today, or, and that's kind of a fun idea, and it's great world building in a way. So but I think like, and that's kind of like Beatbox's powers, where it's like, it's much more confusing. You don't know what you're going to get until you actually see it. Once you've established things, then it's and like we use like color palettes for different sound, because we don't have sound in a comic. So we use color, we use other, we use text, we use, with Taylor Esposito, he's the letterer on the book. We have conversations about like what that should look like. Wancho with the color palettes, and then Matt with like, drawing or using shape imagery to represent different sounds or pieces of music or genres. And so it's like, there's a lot of different ways you can make sound visual in a comic, which we've been exploring a lot. And, you'll see a lot more of that in issue 2 and issue 3. You get a taste of it in issue 1, but we only give you like a little bit of a taste, And so it's, we get into that a lot more as the comic progresses as well. And then I've come up with some really wild and fun ideas later on down the road on like how I can use, different things that you don't think about as sound.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that was one of my first things when I read the first issue was, number one, fusion music exists all over the world.
Yeah.
So the idea of him using fusion music to take two powers that he likes and trying to make like a new one is definitely in the works. I know for a fact it has to be, because there's so much unlimited possibilities. I think what surprised me most after reading it was when I think of driving home, especially or like from the city, and like you're driving trying to listen to your music, but you keep hearing something else in the background and almost cancels your music out, and how he thinks he's coming in with rock as super strength, but he doesn't realize that the club's speakers are louder, playing a different music, kind of changing his music, his own power.
In LA, you'd be like driving back. I'd be driving back from the station. I'd be listening to my music. Then I'd have the window down, and next to me would be like, a truck roll up, and they're playing like two dudes are in there rocking out to mariachi music. And so it all kind of blends together. But like, in the comic, I use like the chaos track, and I sort of introduce that idea, which is, almost like just the amalgam of just noise just thrown at you. Like what does that do? Like it creates a sense of chaos. And that idea came from like when I was dancing, I got they sent me over to Austria for this like summer thing. And there was a big music festival going on. And I remember after we had finished dancing, we were walking through like this pretty old downtown area, and these like this middle-aged couple came out, and I was like 18 at the time, I think, or 19. And they came out and they said, "Hey, you guys want the tickets to this, music performance? We're not going to go see the second act." And I was like, "Heck yeah, I'll take them." So I took it and I went in, and it was the Sound of Music stage, the one where they shot that famous scene before they escape.
Yeah.
And it was some crazy guy, and he had like this like idea that he was just going to pummel the audience with just noise from every direction. So they had like a bunch of like bands in like the front corners, the back corners, behind you, in the middle. And then he just played they played like the whole, like this 20-minute piece. And it was just like, it just completely swallowed you in sound. And you felt like both at peace and totally overwhelmed at the same time. Once you had sort of accepted your fate that like I can't, like I could walk out, but like, maybe that'd be kind of rude. So I'll sit it out. But then it was like 25 minutes, but you were like there and you were in it. And so I was like, well, what would that look like? If it was car horns and sirens and, construction and people screaming and, kids laughing and all this stuff. And that is like the epitome of like the noise or the chaos track, which is normal life. Outside I can hear, some bugs singing. So it's like, it's that kind of, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's and they've addressed kind of the similar thing in other movies, and usually I feel like it's martial arts movies where they'll be like, even though there's no music playing, like there's that natural music in life, that harmony where everything's kind of working together. And I think that is something that is profound, because a lot of people are going to be like, oh, well, he doesn't have his boombox, let's see your hero work now. Like there's always a song, whether you recognize it and you can harness that energy, that's a different story. But there is the song playing.
Yeah. And so I like the idea of like all sound gives him some kind of power. Not all sound gives him an effective power. Some sound might give him just like a dirt crap power where just like, he's good at jumping side to side. Something dumb. And there's humor in that too, where it's like certain songs or things that you don't like or whatever, you can play with it and make jokes about it or things like that. Or like take a piece of like really fluttery and sort of, light music and make that this music that gives him like flight powers or things. It's exactly. Like you can play with it. And it's like, it's such a fun way of like keeping fights fresh in a comic and in a story, but it's also an interesting way of I think well, I don't know, it keeps it diverse and it keeps it fresh. I think.
Yeah
All
right, well, it sounds like we got a lot coming down the pipeline then.
Yes, if I have my way and I end up if I can tell the story I want to tell. And that was the whole thing about doing it indie is you kind of get a lot more of your, you get to make the choices for the book and for good or bad. And but honestly, I think nowadays it's more good than anything. You're allowed to just like, we're seeing a lot of really cool indie comics coming out, from a bunch of different creators. You've got a lot of illustrators who've never done comics before, but just really solid like artists, and like all of a sudden they have a story to tell. And so they turn it into a comic, throw it up on Kickstarter, and, a few months later it arrives at your door. It's kind of fun, so.
Definitely. For everyone listening, obviously we have issue 1 is out. I know we talked a little bit about before the show. Issue 2 is you are selling it, but we do have a Kickstarter for issue 2. It sounds like issue 3 also as well.
Yeah, so we're gonna do. Right now we have a Kickstarter pre-launch page up for issue 2, but we're gonna run it as issue 2 and issue 3. So it's gonna be like a bunch of story thrown at you. Like issue 2 is like a little over 40 pages. And then issue 3 is like another 30 pages. So it's it's like 70 pages of story. And then I think issue 1 is 32 pages. So we're really kind of not conforming to that like standard issue format. We're letting the issue be as long as it needs to be to tell the story we need it to be, need it to tell. So it's a sort of free format, and you can't really get away with that all the time, with other publishers. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, just depends. But, comics per page can get a little pricey for people. So you kind of have to weigh it, but we like to explore what we need out of the issue and make sure that we're not cheating our audience. So like we had a big conversation, me and Matt, about issue 2, where we wanted this like awesome fight sequence in issue 2, and we had to have like this we were talking about it, and I was like, I want it to be big, like really cool. And we were like, well, we can only do it. I set aside a certain number of pages, and then we mapped it out, and I'm like, oh, we got to add like 4 pages to this. We need like way more action. I was like, let's put it in there. And we did it, And at a publisher, you'd have to get that approved. And chances are they wouldn't want you to spend another $1,000 or plus for just 4 more pages, So, but we can.
That's the beauty of it. Awesome. So for everyone listening, we will have the link to the pre-launch page wherever you see this, either on YouTube or Instagram. Let's say they went ahead, they signed up for the pre-launch, they're interested in getting these issues, but they still want to start the story. I'm assuming you guys have a web store that people can go to.
So we are actually, our website store is going to be up probably by the end of next week. We've been working we have a website, and we've been working overtime to try and get like a real store. The whole thing's being redesigned, to host people so they can log in, they can track their orders, that kind of thing. So it's been a top to bottom, redesign of like what we want Excavation's branding to look like and all that stuff. So really like trying to take it up a notch so people can, engage and like feel more like a community, more like a real, like a bigger publisher, because we have grand aspirations, and we've got other books in development as well that should be coming out, later this year or early next. So it's been a growing endeavor, and we're definitely very thankful for all the people who have been hopping on board and checking out the comics, because it's keeping the dream alive.
Definitely. That's the goal. For everyone listening, we'll have the pre-launch link in the comments. If you are interested in getting on to this story, it's a great story. You're going to definitely want to read it. Follow the pre-launch, sign up for it. And then as they launch their store and as we get more and more information, we will post it. Thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for answering our questions. Beatbox and Tune was fantastic. It's a great read. You put a lot of work into it, and it shows. And we look forward to having you on in the future as we talk about this book as it unfolds. Where is the best place for people to follow you to keep up to date with what you're working on?
So the best places to do it is you can go to excavationcomics.com and sign up for our email list. That's my favorite thing to do. We can send pages, we can send more art through there. We talk a little bit about the process and what we're doing, and comic shop signings we're doing, that kind of thing. So that's our like place of community, and that we run through like Substack. And then we have a Instagram, which is just at Excavation Comic. And we pretty much just use those 2 things to our disposal. We have like a small YouTube channel and that kind of thing. But for the most part, we limit so that we can keep our audience in one place or 2 places.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, for everyone listening, I hope you had a good time. Hope you enjoyed it. Check out Excavation Comics. You'll be looking forward to this next comic. Again, thank you for coming on. Everyone listening, have a good night.